tutorial, we are going to create a sort of spring animating up and down. This is a little bit more advanced to the level 2 spring, if you may see that in my playlist. We'll be pushing on a little bit more with that. So first things first, you should have your kind of typical classic Maya loadout as such. Now, we actually want to access a few more of the settings which I don't have on the classic loadout. So to kind of get to that point, we're going to go up to the workspace menu at the top, and I'm going to go down to animation. And if we select that, we should then get a change in the loadout. And this is going to load up the graph editor, which is going to be really fundamental in kind of helping improve the quality of our animation. And we still have retained all those kind of features that we had before. And if we turn on the outliner for our assets, we'll be able to see that as well. So I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to go down to polygon primitives, and we're going to create a helix. So the reason we're doing this again is because it's quite visually interesting. There's lots to kind of play around with, and we're going to hopefully experiment with that quite nicely. So I'm going to go to panels, go to orthographic, and I'm going to go to the side view. Okay. So I'm just going to prep the objects ready for this. So I'm just going to rename it. Remember to keep renaming your objects. Large scenes can become problematic. Let's say I was going to create a scene with loads of these in, and we'll call this Spring 1. And with pushing W to get the translate tool and selecting the green arrow and dragging that up, I'm just going to pull that to roughly about there. So let's type in 1 here just to be really clean with that. And I'm then going to reset these, sorry, not delete, I'm going to reset these back to their original form. So I'm just going to go to modify, freeze transformations, and we now have that saved. So I changed that, I don't know why I did that, ignore that please. So we've now got that set at 0, and we now have our object ready to kind of animate. So the first thing we're going to do is actually now prepare our scene for animation. So we've obviously got a timeline down here, which is good for selecting specific frames on the timeline. We have a time slider, so we can navigate through the time frame window for whatever your scene or my scene may be set up as. And we can adapt that at the side here by changing certain properties. But before we do that, we need to actually change the frame rate. So at the moment it's on 24 frames per second, and we can change it here. But actually we need to ensure that we're playing back at the right speed. So I'm going to go into this running man icon with the little gear next to his head, or it looks like a sun gear, whichever. And I'm going to change the frame rate to 30 frames per second. And down here, you'll see playback speed is set to 30 frames times 1. But on yours, you'll probably find that it's set by default and play every frame. Now this is okay for the first run, that it might play back across this timeline. But after that, it's just going to keep getting faster and faster, and so it's going as fast as your kind of processor can push it to. So we want to avoid that. So we're going to keep that. We're going to keep it on 30 frames per second times 1. If you haven't got it to there, change it to it. And with 30 seconds frames per second on 0.5, that would be half the speed. That would be twice as fast. You can set your own, but we'll just have times 1, and we'll click save. So from this point on, you'll see that it's actually changed some of the parts on the timeline, and we'll see we've got 1.25, which is quite an awkward time to work with as an animator. So we're just going to reset those to 1, and it's still on 125 there, so I'm going to click on this timeline, right left mouse button, clicking it, now reset it to 1. And up here, we just want to create a 1-second loop today. So I'm actually just going to change the slider and the scene to 30 frames per second, because we just don't need anything else. We're going to just push that to reset the graph editor as well. So we've got our 30 frames, we've got our playback speed set, we've set up our time slider and our timeline. So now we're ready to start to begin animating. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select our object, and the shortcut for setting the keyframe is the S key. So if you keep your eye on the channel box, so if you've not got the channel box selected, find it on the right hand side. If you can't see it, look for this icon up here, and if you select it, it will appear. Now on this window here, as I push the S key to record, you'll see red boxes have now appeared. If I remove myself from that keyframe, you'll see that they've changed to pink. So that means there are keys selected on the object, but we are not currently on an active frame. We're not currently on the active frame that we've selected on. So from here, I'm going to go to frame 30, which is our endpoint, and I'm going to push S again. And you'll see we've now created time and space. But as those values are both on 0, nothing's changing. Okay. So if we go halfway through to frame 15, I've double clicked there by mistake. Let's click the object again. There we go. Okay. And I'm actually just going to middle mouse button, hold up and drag up and zoom out a little bit just to get a bit more room. I'm actually just going to pull this up about 10 along translate Y. I'm actually just going to type it in to be a bit more cleaner. I'm going to push S again. Now you'll see on the graph editor we actually have this really big curve. So at the moment we're on 0 to 1, if you actually look at the focus there. So if I push this square again, it's actually going to frame this object's animation to the highest point. So now we have the R1, R0, sorry, to 10. And on the here we have the individual parameters and the curves for that object. So all the you can look at these individually. So on Translate Y we can see that we have a curve representing our journey from 0 to 10 and back to 0. If I push play in the bottom right corner, you'll see that we now have this kind of levitating spring. As an object, as something hits makes contact with a surface, let's say we're dropping a ball, that object is going to bounce back up really quickly. And what should be happening is as our object rises up here, we need to have a delay because there is a fight between gravity and the energy of the object that's pushing it up, and eventually gravity will win and pull that back down. Now as gravity pulls it back down, it gains momentum, it pushes it harder, it pulls it in harder, and it should really actually come back up really quickly once it gets to the ground level. And at the moment we have it easing out and easing in, and it's actually doing it at the top. At the top this is fine because we need it to, we need that fight with gravity there. But down the bottoms here, we actually need to change that. So at the moment you see that's levitating, there's a bit of a drag as it pulls up. If we change these by clicking and dragging over and go into this symbol that looks like a wand or a lollipop, and that's going to give us what we call a linear tangent on the curve. So if I play it back at this point, you do feel it. You know, it's spending a minimal amount of time at the bottom, and it is spending a little bit longer in the air. It's not exactly over exaggerated at this point, but we can feel it. So with that curve set, I'm going to select the object again. I'm actually going to want it to now spin, much like on my level 2 demonstration. I want it to spin as it starts from here, goes the fourth way around, and ends at 360. So I've already set a keyframe at 0. So I'm going to go to frame 30. There's already a 0 set at 0 for our rotate Y. And then at frame 30, I'm going to go in and I'm going to type 360, which is obviously the amount of degrees there are in a circle. And I'm going to then right click and go to key selected. Or I can push the S key again. So that's another way that you can set a keyframe. Now, if we look at our graph editor at this point, so I'm going to frame it again, you'll see that this line here represents our 360 degree turn. Now what happens if we look, you'll see that it jumps up, so it just goes up and then it does a turn on the way down. So if we play that back, it's not really going to be doing what we actually want it to do. Okay, and the reason for that is because we have a keyframe set at frame 15 on this parameter. Now this is one of the fundamental issues with using the S key. It's going to record everything, so that when you actually want to plan out movements later on, it can become problematic. The solution at this point is to click and drag this middle icon here and push delete. Okay, and you'll see that it's now deleted because that is actually red, and we don't need the keyframe there. It's actually just going to go quite nicely as it does. But you'll see there's the ease in and ease out applying here, so I'm actually going to click and drag those and make them linear. So we actually have a really clean turn going around that object. And we may play around with that again later on. So with our object now been set, we now need to start thinking about adding in some other animation principles, notably squash and stretch. That is that it's going to squash on the impact and it's going to stretch in the air. Now, obviously in real life, a spring probably wouldn't do that if it was if it wasn't very flimsy, it probably wouldn't happen. But obviously in animation, it's not about realism, especially for feature film animation. It's about believability. In most cases, if we were working towards live action with VFX, or if we were working on some aspects of games where kind of verisimilitude and that realism is inherent, we probably wouldn't do it this way. But as a keyed performance kind of driven animation that's quite fun and playful, we're going to add in that little bit of exaggeration on that squash and stretch. So with our object selected, we're going to go to frame 1 by clicking on frame 1. And I'm going to scroll down here on the channel box down to the polyhelix. And in the polyhelix, we're actually going to click on just one of the words, and I'm going to push S. And you'll see we're now actually able to record these parameters by having them open. I'm then going to go back to the final frame. I'm going to push S again. And then in the middle, I'm going to set the height to 4. So it opens up, and I'm just going to change the width slightly. So as it's obviously opening up, I'll actually do 1.8. That's a little bit too much. It obviously thins out because it is we would expect it to be a solid mass. Now I haven't set that to keyframe by pushing S, so it's automatically gone back to what is keyed. So I'm just going to put that in again, 4 and 1.8, and I'm going to push S. And if we play that back now, you'll see we actually have that opening up as it goes up, which is quite nice. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is add in the squash at the bottom. Now to do this, we're actually going to go back up to the spring parameters. So at frame 1, I'm going to go in, and on frame X, I'm going to type in 1.5, sorry. And again on scale Z, we can't see scale X because we're not live in the scene. And on scale Y, I'm going to type in 0.5. Okay, actually I'm going to do a little bit less. I'm going to do 0.6. And I'm actually just going to select those 3 parameters. I'm going to hold down the right mouse button and go key selected. Okay, and that means that I haven't changed any other parameters. I've only changed those 3, or at least recorded those 3. Then at the end, I'm going to do the same. So that's 1.5 on scale X, 0.6 on scale Y, and 1.5 on scale Z. Now, if I hold down the right mouse button, you will see that we now have that squash happening at the bottom. But it still doesn't quite feel right. Okay, and there's a reason for this. I'm just going to stop. So when we're down here, it's squashed. We can actually pull this object down a little bit more. We're actually going to take it down to the surface level, which is about there. Okay, I'm just going to click on this and copy it by pushing Control C. If you're on a Mac, you might do Command C. Push Enter, and I'm going to right click and key selected. And I'm going to go to the start point here as well and do the same thing. And right click and key selected. Now, the other thing that's happening is if we actually look at this, that squash is starting here. It's starting mid-air. It's starting way too soon. Now, if this was a real object, that squash would not happen necessarily until it hits the ground. We can allow that opening up to kind of start to close in, but that stretch outwards and that compression, that level of compression, would not happen until contact was really made with the surface. So we actually need to go back in and add in what we call contact points. So a contact point is where that object is actually hitting the ground. So at frame 3, I'm going to change the scale and everything back to 1. Okay, on these parts here, and I'll push key selected. And at frame 28, I'm also going to do the same thing. I'm going to change those 3 to 1. So if you click and drag over those, the top one and the bottom one, it will change all the ones that are selected. And then right click, key selected. And now what we have is a really nice, playful animation. Now, it is squashing and stretching. We can kind of see it, but we don't really see it. And the important thing here is that we feel it. So although it's not massively visible and in the air we can see lots of kind of change and get an eye of the features, actually it's better coming from the ground. So I just wanted to do one more thing. It's coming from the jump up, sorry. That squash is happening down there, is what I was meant to say, sorry. But the last thing I wanted to do is actually just try changing this rotate again. So I'm just going to take away that key on the rotate wire. And this time I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm just going to give them flat tangents. And I'm just going to see if that kind of delayed turn as it spins actually adds to this. So it's kind of getting maximum turn energy when it's in the air and then starts to decline again. Yeah, I quite like that. So, in this tutorial we've looked at changing our workspace. We've looked at prepping our timeline and time sliders. We've looked at setting keyframes, both through using the shortcut S key and prioritizing on the channel box and selecting individual frames, which obviously has their benefits because we have more control. And we've also looked at using the curve editor, looking at what we call flat and linear tangents, which have helped us change the timing and spacing within the object's movement. So thank you for watching. I hope you've had success yourselves. Don't forget to save your file as you finish, because there's nothing worse than losing work. So